Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist, anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Saligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, or send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm is a locally owned co-op specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This is the Final Straw radio show. I'm your host, Cypress. This week we bring you two different segments. First, I spoke with Jenny from Project Fang, a project that financially supports visits to Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners. Since 2016, Project Fang has worked to combat the isolation of incarceration these prisoners feel by providing a fund for financial assistance for visits. Prisoners and their loved ones can apply to the fund to help pay for prison visits, which is one of the most important ways of supporting prisoners. Project Fang is currently in the middle of a fundraising push as they look to double their annual budget to continue their work. Folks can support their campaign through December 4th at fundraiser.com/project_fang. Head to the Project Fang Twitter or to the New York City Anarchist Black Cross website at nycabc.wordpress.com/fang to learn more. All funds go directly to supporting visits for incarcerated animal and ecological defenders who have committed to not cooperating with the state. Our second segment is a talk by Tyler on the technopolitics of Crypto-Anarchy. This talk was recorded at the 2019 North American Anarchist Studies Network Conference in Atlanta, Georgia. But first, a few words from anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a what?
I have many times been told that I have an anger problem. I may have mentioned this before. I don't think I do. I think I'm frequently angry. But anger is a legitimate response to intense and continuous fart goblinery on a massive scale. In a world absent fart goblins, I'd be nothing but rainbows and bunny rabbits. Anyway, a friend of mine wrote recently describing difficulties at her job, government harassment, and so on. And she described how she is now angry all the time and how this is unsustainable. I think what she expresses is something we can all relate to. We've either felt it or know others who have. This unsustainable anger is symptomatic of burnout and breakdown and breakup, all of the things we see destroying rebels in communities of resistance. When I wrote her back, I shared a personal secret for managing anger, and so I'm going to share that secret with you too. My inspiration for this approach to anger comes from my uncle. My uncle couldn't give blood because he carried some kind of blood-borne disease. He didn't have the disease himself, and he never developed any of the symptoms. He was what they call a carrier. If he gave blood, the person receiving the transfusion could get the disease he carried, so he couldn't get blood. When it comes to anger, when it comes to the experience of trauma, I try to be like my uncle. Rather than suffer the trauma and the anger, I prefer to be more of a carrier. By this method, you receive the trauma and anger and then carry it to where it needs to go, preferably back to its source. I'm not a heart attack sufferer. I'm not a suicide. I'm a heart attack carrier. I'm a suicide carrier. I deliver heart attacks and suicides where they need to go. By this approach, you have to cultivate a creative response to those who inflict trauma upon you and arouse your anger. If you passively accept the trauma, if you simply swallow it and internalize it, that trauma can turn toxic. It can fester, rot you from the inside out. That's just unhealthy. It's psychologically unhealthy and physically unhealthy. In my own case, before I suffered a year of domestic torture beginning in 2012, I suffered high blood pressure and hypertension. I lived in an environment of intolerable stress, but I was paralyzed by fear, afraid that if I were to respond assertively to my environment, I'd get labeled and targeted, and it would negatively impact my parole chances. But one of the accidentally beneficial consequences of being tortured for a year is my blood pressure went down and the hypertension went away. Why? Because I lost my fear of swinging back. There were the days of tear gas, blood, and vomit when Blackjack and I nearly defeated the jackboots of the Mansfield Correctional Cell Extraction Team, 7-on-2 close quarter blind fighting. Then came Blast Blog and speaking out on the radio, and something getting torched at Gestapo Gary's house. All of these counterattacks provide some small amount of catharsis and a sense of a job well done. Gestapo Gary and Trainwreck Trevor, the principal architects of Ohio's domestic torture regimen, no longer work for Ohio's prisons. Gary is a consultant in North Carolina, and Trevor is a lawyer for Wexner Medical Center at Ohio State University. But North Carolina prisoners are off the chain resisting Gestapo Gary's JPay project, and Wexner Medical Center's board of directors just got 25 letters describing Trainwreck's crimes against humanity. If he's not fired soon, I suspect cartoons of Trainwreck are going to pop up all over campus. My point is, I strive to be a suicide carrier, a heart attack delivery system. I think it's a healthy approach to trauma and to those things that arouse anger, to consciously exercise your personal power rather than powerlessness. Fight, resist, escalate, escalate, escalate. But always with imagination. You have to resist in ways that are fun and joyful. In fact, the fun and joy you put into it and the fun and joy you get out of it just enhance the misery of your enemy. It's bad enough that they inflicted trauma upon you and you somehow managed to turn the tables, but it really adds insult to injury for them when they witness you laughing until you pee a little bit. That just makes their humiliation and defeat absolutely intolerable. And again, on some level, it comes back to the question of whether you truly value yourself. If you do, you will defend you. You will avenge yourself and will actively confront anyone who does not share your assessment of your own value. But really, it only makes sense. Who wants to be the heart attack sufferer? We need to be the heart attack carriers and suicide carriers. That's a much healthier approach to trauma and anger. I'm not suggesting you should want conflict, but if you're left no other alternative, you might as well be good at it. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain in exile from Ohio at Buckingham Correctional in Dillwyn, Virginia. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at his latest address at Sean Swain, number 2015638, Buckingham Correctional, P.O. Box 430, Dillwyn, Virginia, 23936. You can find his past writings, recordings of his audio segments, and updates on his case at seanswain.org, or now follow him on Twitter at @SwainRocks.
Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners? Any name, pronouns, and a description of the political work that you do?
Sure. My name's Jenny. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a part of Project Fang. I've been doing prisoner support and anti-repression work off and on for about 13 years now. Much of that work originally focused on earth and animal liberation prisoners. Environmental movements were sort of my entrance into the world of activism, and so I had personal connections to some of those folks. And then over the years, I've done support for people doing time from a broad spectrum of different movements and struggles.
Could you tell us about how and when Project Fang was created?
Sure. Project Fang began in about 2016, although we had been talking about the need for such a project for quite a while before it actually happened. It was really born out of the North American Anarchist Black Cross Conference, where people were meeting annually to talk about all the great organizing that was happening around prisoner support. so much great work was being done, but there was one thing that kept coming up for us, which was the really sad reality that many of the prisoners we were supporting were not getting visits in any sort of consistent way. It wasn't really that people didn't want to visit, of course. It was just that the financial burden of visiting was often too heavy for folks to carry on their own. In the federal system, which is where a lot of our work was happening, prisoners can be moved anywhere in the country. And so that often ends up meaning that they are hundreds or even thousands of miles away from their support bases. So for people to visit them, they have to shell out cash for plane tickets. Often prisons are in very remote places. So once they get to a big city with an airport, they have to rent a car to drive out to where the prison is located. Then, of course, they have to pay for gas, usually a night in a hotel, and of course, food expenses. If they have children, they might also have childcare expenses. And of course, taking time off of work is another sort of expense. So, as I'm sure you can tell, all of these things add up to hundreds of dollars really quickly. And this is actually why people aren't getting visits. So Project Fang was really meant to fill this gap in the organizing work that was happening. Because we know from talking to so many prisoners over the years that visits are really such an important lifeline for people who are inside. Along with letters and phone calls, visits are really the only way for people inside to maintain their connections with their people and their communities outside. And while letters and phone calls are incredibly important, of course, there isn't really anything that can take the place of face-to-face human contact. When people are in prison, they often don't have any meaningful physical contact with other humans for incredibly long periods of time. And that's partly why prisons are so effective at breaking people down. They attempt to strip people of their humanity in so many basic ways, but this is probably the biggest one. Denying people their ability to connect with their loved ones really magnifies the isolation of a prison cell in unimaginable ways. And so we were sort of getting the sense from a lot of the prisoners that we were talking to over the years that this was something that they needed more of course. And so Project Fang came into existence.
Are there specific issues or challenges or punishments faced by Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners, either during their prosecution or incarceration, that ultimately inform the work of Project Fang?
So I think Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners really face the same challenges that all prisoners face, the isolation and brutality of the prison system. And I'm a little wary of exceptionalizing them because I think that in the end, prison doesn't really care who you are or where you came from. It really treats everyone with a cruelty and inhumanity that we should all be challenging, regardless of who is trapped inside. But that being said, there are a couple of things that come up sort of consistently for folks from Earth and Animal Liberation backgrounds. One thing that is sometimes an issue for Earth and Animal Liberation folks is just getting their dietary needs met. If folks are vegan, their access to nutritional meals can be pretty limited. This does actually seem to be improving in tiny bits and pieces, but it can still be a real problem for folks, especially people who are pre-trial and who might be stuck in smaller county jails, which often don't have the same options as the larger federal facilities. Another problem that folks sometimes encounter is that they are sometimes labeled terrorists by the prosecution. And then this designation sometimes follows them throughout their time in the Bureau of Prisons. So a terrorism enhancement not only affects the amount of time a prisoner serves, but it will also most likely affect where and how they serve it. So for example, some folks, radical folks, and also of course many Muslim folks who have been labeled terrorists end up in high security units or prisons. These are called sometimes communications management units or CMUs. And there's one in Terre Haute, Indiana, and another one in Marion, Illinois. And these are basically extremely restrictive units that really limit a prisoner's ability to have visitors, make phone calls, or just otherwise communicate with folks on the outside. And once people get inside the CMU, it can also be incredibly difficult to figure out how to get them out of it. A terrorism enhancement really affects also how guards and other prisoners interact with the person. It means their communications are more heavily monitored or censored or restricted. And it also means that they will sometimes be more closely watched by the Special Investigative Services, which is basically like the FBI of the prison system. Really, though, I think Project Fang's mission is just to ensure that Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners get visits. And again, that's a problem that's experienced by all prisoners. There's a statistic on the fundraising site that says only 31% of prisoners have had a personal visit in the last 30 days. And to me, that's a really horrific statistic.
Anarchist prisoner Eric King and his partner actually spoke to Burst a few months ago about CMUs. Could you elaborate a little bit on the difficulty of getting someone transferred out of a CMU?
I know in particular, Daniel McGowan was an Earth Liberation prisoner who spent time in the CMU. And I'm just remembering from his time there that his legal team fought really hard to get him out of there. And normally, when a person is moved to a prison, it's normally very hard to get them moved somewhere else, no matter where they are. But there is technically a sort of bureaucratic process that a prisoner can go through to get their designation changed or to get their points changed. All of those things affect where they're placed within the BOP. But once a person is in a CMU, those processes, for a variety of reasons, become really much more difficult to go through. And so it's sort of like this weird spot that people get in where there's not even like a certified bureaucratic process to go through anymore. They're just kind of stuck there.
How are Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners able to access support from Project Fang?
So Project Fang tries to make things as simple and as accessible as possible, sort of understanding that people inside have a lot of trouble sometimes navigating things like this because of the way that the BOP functions, and they sort of intentionally make it more complicated for people. And there are a couple of different ways that people can request funds. They can either contact us directly by mail, or they can have someone in their support team contact us for funds. We ask the prisoner to send us the name or names of people that they would like to visit them, and then we sort of go through that list and contact people on the list. If a person who would like to visit or someone from the support team contacts us, we confirm, of course, with the prisoner that they want that person to visit before dispersing funds. Right now, people are eligible for funds on a quarterly basis, and we send out periodic reminders to people who qualify. To qualify, a person must be an Earth or Animal Liberation prisoner who has maintained a stance of non-cooperation with the state. And our ability to offer funds, of course, depends on our ability to keep replenishing the fund. So that's why we're doing the fundraising right now, hoping to sort of double the funds that we have for the next year so we can keep getting visits for people. There are a lot of things that people have to pay for when they visit, which we went over a bunch of them, plane tickets and car rentals and paying for a hotel and then childcare costs and all the things. And, of course, it depends on how far a person is going. If someone's in New York and their person is in prison in Texas, it's going to be different than if somebody's in Sacramento, California, and they have to go to LA. So all of those things are going to make a difference. We do have two general tiers with Project Fang. Tier 1 is meant to be about $300, and Tier 2 is meant to be about $500. And, of course, there's wiggle room there. We ask that people really just request what they think they're going to use. And then if they end up not using all of it, we ask that people put the remainder either back into the fund or, donate it to the person they're visiting or find some other way to put it towards prisoner support. But, even just a plane ticket, if I wanted to fly from where I live in Washington State to visit somebody in New York, that's going to be a good $500 probably round trip, depending on how well I plan, just for the plane ticket. And then if you factor in renting a car, that's another at least $70. And then staying a night in a hotel, that's probably another at least $90. So yeah, it adds up very fast. And, that's not even counting, like I said, time off of work and childcare and all those sort of hidden expenses that aren't actually a part of the visit itself. So it's very expensive.
Your project's been facilitating visits to prisoners for 3 years now. Can you speak to any positive feedback you've gotten, either from prisoners themselves or the people who've been able to visit?
I mean, probably the best way for people to see that is to go to the fundraising site. There are several sort of very lovely artistic things on the website that have quotes from people who have visited, including people who visited Marius Mason. I think Nicole Cassan's, some of her folks are on there. And, I will say that that has been one of the, at least for us, the folks who are sort of running the fund, that's really been like one of the most rewarding things is just hearing back from people who have been able to visit with the fund, hearing about their visits and, hearing the excitement from them and how much it meant to them and how much it meant to the people they were visiting. And then, of course, those people come back and use the fund again, which is great. That's what we want. We want people to know it's there and for them to keep using it. So that's been really, really awesome and really affirming for us.
Could you tell us the different ways that people can support your fundraiser during this recent fundraising push?
Yeah, of course. I would love to. So the fundraiser is on fundraiser.com. It's fundrazr.com/project_fang. And of course, we'd love it if people could share that with all of their contacts. The fundraiser officially ends on December 4th, so if people could be sure to have their donation in by then, that would be great. And there are links, I think, on various other Twitters and all the social medias, but the fundraiser page is probably the best direct access to the project.
The fundraiser speaks to an increase in Earth and Animal Liberation prisoners, which brings up not only the issue of escalating climate crisis and environmental destruction, but also the reality of continued prosecution and sentencing of environmental activists in the United States. Since Earth and Animal Liberation actually encompasses an array of ecological issues, could you speak to some of the different types of activism some of the prisoners supported by Project Fang have been connected to? And then also, as someone who's been engaged in prisoner support and anti-repression work for years, are there any notable trends in the prosecution and sentencing of these activists that stick out to you?
Figure out how to sort of weave those together. I mean, as far as, the question around the sort of actions that people are taking and how to weave those things all together. I mean, I think there are probably people who are better equipped than I am to speak to the issues that people are taking action around. But I think the issues on some level are not anything new, right? People have known for quite some time that climate change is a threat and that catastrophe is just around the corner. But knowing a thing, of course, and doing something about it are very different. And unfortunately, as is often the case with humans, things had to get really bad before there was any sort of real dialogue, at least in the mainstream, about what was going on. And of course, some people have been sounding the alarm for years, in particular, folks who are most directly impacted by things like rising sea levels and so-called natural disasters that climate change is so often associated with. Unfortunately, it's often the most vulnerable and marginalized communities, including often Black and Brown folks, Indigenous folks, and poor folks. But now we've reached this seriously critical juncture, and I think more and more people are feeling urgency around these issues. Things like the devastation and destruction caused by the Dakota Access Pipeline, or just fossil fuel consumption generally, and deforestation and sea level rise. I mean, the list goes on, right? And I think all of these are things that people are really stepping up now and pushing back on. And of course, that means more people will be facing prison time. And as far as trends in the state's targeting of activists, I have to admit, I'm not sure I actually see this as too much different than how things have been for quite some time. I think maybe people are noticing it more with the mainstreaming of climate justice action. For example, if folks think back not that far in time to the Operation Backfire cases in the mid-2000s, those folks were being threatened with hundreds of years in prison, which is really similar to what is happening with folks like Ruby Montoya, who are being threatened with anywhere from 10 to 130 years in prison for an alleged sabotage of the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2017. And of course, we have folks like Marius Mason and Eric McDavid, who were sentenced to 22 years and 20 years respectively. And, in Eric's case, no actions were ever even carried out. There was only talk of action. So I think anytime, the state notices that people are starting to do something other than write letters or sign online petitions, it starts to feel real pressure from the people who are in charge. And I don't mean the state, I mean the people who pay them, the corporations and all that jazz. So because, the real action that people are taking now is threatening their bottom line. And so people are gonna be in prison. Um, and, more people are taking action and that's great. But it also means we need to be smarter about how we respond. Because, of course, the state is always looking for more creative ways to target people. One way that states have done this in the last, I don't know, couple decades is through the use of what is referred to as ag gag laws, which are basically laws that criminalize undercover investigations and whistleblowing regarding animal agriculture. In essence, they create fines and penalties specifically for people who film and report on the conditions inside places like factory farms or fur farms or research facilities. And actually, these laws are becoming increasingly broad, and some states have passed legislation criminalizing whistleblowing in all sorts of industries, including places like nursing homes or hospitals or schools. Another thing that's been happening in more recent years is that several states have passed statutes designed to repress people resisting the expansion of infrastructure. So this is like especially important around pipeline actions or oil refineries, things like that. Since 2017, at least 18 states have considered bills that criminalize protests disrupting construction or operation of pipelines. 7 of those states have been successful in passing bills, and several others are just currently considering them. And basically, those laws look to increase misdemeanors to felonies or increase punishments and penalties for both civil and criminal violations. For example, in Texas, anybody who intends to damage or destroy a pipeline facility could face up to 10 years in prison. And of course, the laws are left really vague and could cover all sorts of activity that would traditionally be thought of as covered by the First Amendment. At this point in history, I hope that people know how tenuous or non existent those so called rights can actually be, but nonetheless, those are the kinds of challenges to the laws that are currently happening in the courts. And sometimes those challenges are successful. So, we got to fight on all fronts here. One other sort of insidious aspect of these laws is that they also threaten broader support for movements by imposing steep fines on organizations that are found to be conspiring with activists who are found guilty. Some states also drafted bills to increase fines and jail sentences for people obstructing highways. This came to be after a lot of the DAPL protests. A North Dakota bill was introduced around that time that would have legalized drivers running over protesters who were standing in a roadway. It basically cleared drivers of liability as long as their action was unintentional. North Carolina, Tennessee, Rhode Island, and Florida all issued similar bills. And thankfully, these laws all failed to pass, but they really illustrate the sort of attempts that the state is making at crushing environmental and indigenous movements. And then, of course, there are things like terrorism enhancements, which we talked about a little while ago. And, basically, these aren't actual laws that people are breaking, but they're just enhancements that get tacked on at the sentencing phase of a person's case. And it really increases the amount of time that a person is facing in prison. And again, the definition of what equates to terrorism is very broad and vague and could really cover just about any kind of protest that people might engage in.
So far, we've touched on how crucial these visits are for prisoners and the folks who are visiting them. Surely also social movements have a lot to gain by keeping prisoners connected to the world outside.
I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when thinking about how it's beneficial for movements to maintain contact with prisoners and to really keep their visits going, keep their letters coming, all those things is, really the most important thing is that these folks are still a part of our movements. Like they're still informing the things that we do. They're informing our strategies. They're informing how we think about all of the struggles that we're involved in, and we need to keep them a part of those struggles. We need to keep them around, and maintaining connections with them through visits is really the most powerful way to do that. I also think that people are probably a lot less likely to be involved in a struggle or in a movement if they think that they are going to be abandoned. if they end up in prison. And, it seems like maybe a weird way to think about why you should do prisoner support, but I think it doesn't lessen the impact of the truth of it. And, if we are going to do this together and we're going to fight the fight together, we need to make sure that that means all the way through. And people need to know that they're going to be supported no matter what happens.
Jenny, thank you so much for your time and for the work that you do. Is there anything that we missed in this interview or any words of farewell you'd like to say to our listeners?
A thing that I think often gets sort of lost in the shuffle when we're talking about prisoner support, and that is just how much this kind of support means to the friends and loved ones of prisoners. Because, prison doesn't just affect the person inside. It affects their family and their lovers and their children and their friends and their comrades. And there are few things that are quite as stressful and terrifying as knowing that your loved one is in a cage and feeling like you are completely powerless to help them. And also knowing that their people outside are suffering can be really devastating for people inside. The pain and horror of feeling completely incapable and powerless to help their loved ones, it takes a real toll on people inside. And visits can help with all of that. So, having your person in front of you physically, hearing their voice, holding their hand if you're lucky enough to be able to do that, just feeling and knowing that they're still here and real and breathing. It may sound so simple, but it's actually monumental. And for a person who's in prison and for the people who love them, those moments can literally be life-saving. So again, I just really encourage people to just take a look at the fundraising page, donate whatever you can. Even just $10 will go a long way towards helping folks. That'll buy a meal for somebody who's visiting. So yeah, thanks for listening, and hope that y'all visit the fundraising page.
This has been Cypress speaking with Jenny from Project Fang, a support fund for animal and earth liberation prisoners. To support their current fundraising push, please visit fundraiser.com/project_Fang. To keep up to date with Project Fang, you can follow them on Twitter or Instagram, or visit nycabc.wordpress.com/Fang. Now, here's a talk by Tyler on the technopolitics of crypto-anarchy from the 2019 North American Anarchist Studies Network Conference in Atlanta, Georgia.
The topic at hand, which is the technopolitics of crypto-anarchy. Okay, so I want to start with a little excerpt, and some of what I'm saying is vignettes from essays that I'm piecing together here to make my case. Prize-winning computer engineer and simultaneous lover of both rabbits and guns, Timothy C. May throws a house party in 1987. A merger of technical systems with its genesis 50 years earlier has fostered new methods for information transfer between individuals and across societies. Computing and mathematics at the intersection of internet encryption. May's clique of programmers assembles at his home to chat computer science and solve ciphers in this setting ripe for innovation. With the advent of RSA encryption a decade earlier in 1977, cryptography, the technique of making ciphers and codes for purposes as diverse as secrecy, authentication, and timestamping, is in renaissance. Alongside their interest in cryptography, the party's attendees fit a niche milieu with predilections for cyberpunk literature and libertarian political thought. Shortly after this get-together, they name their community the Cypherpunks and inaugurate a listserv forum. The next several years will see a flourishing in membership to the Cypherpunk mailing list, including future WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, multiple Tor browser developers, and several key figures in the, at the time, non-existent cryptocurrency scene. The invention of numerous cryptographic tools and the publication of various credos articulating the group's informal ideology also spawned from this house party. From May's keyboard came the neologism Crypto-Anarchy, alongside the most vociferous, comprehensive, and well-circulated of these new cypherpunk and crypto-anarchist missives. So this is kind of the context in which crypto-anarchy emerges. I'm going to see if I can actually manipulate my slides, or if... Let's see. There we go. Good enough. So I want to situate crypto-anarchy now with a quote from Timothy C. May, the individual who launched the cypherpunk mailing list and kind of got this whole informal ideology started. Some of us cypherpunks believe various forms of strong cryptography will cause the power of the state to decline, perhaps even collapse fairly abruptly. We believe the expansion into cyberspace with secure communications, digital money, anonymity and pseudonymity, and other crypto-mediated interactions will profoundly change the nature of economics and social interactions. When we try to define crypto-anarchy, it's a little bit nebulous, but it starts here with a sort of anti-state perspective and the rigorous belief that strong cryptography, which is to say cryptography that individuals can use but governments can't break, would facilitate new social, political, and economic contexts for political resistance. And in May's vision, and in May's writing specifically, this is a very market-based, individualized vision of what we're going to get out of this advent of cryptography. His theoretical influences include agorism, which was a sort of rebel free market ideology developed by the thinker Samuel Edward Konkin III, and a sort of Ayn Randian individualism. May lived alone in the mountains in Northern California with his dogs, his cats, and his guns, presumably his rabbits. This was a abiding quirk of his personality. But May was situating crypto-anarchy within a specifically anarchist milieu. He was emphasizing the overall anarchy of the internet, which he viewed as leaderless. The cypherpunks themselves, the group that May had started to build these cryptographic ciphers, were self-organizing and operated a consensus, a loose filiative consensus model. And there was an emphasis on practice. May's good friend and co-founder of the cypherpunks, Eric Hughes, said cypherpunks write code. It's a practical mandate. Cypherpunks break the laws they don't like. These sorts of phrases proliferated on this listserv. So crypto-anarchy was situated within a consciously anarchist milieu, but it had all of these other theoretical influences, which we associate more with kind of big L libertarianism, and as such it kind of got captured by the market. So if we were to define crypto-anarchy, May is clear that it's a deliberate pun on several meanings. One is the Greek word kryptos means hidden, concealed. It's an adjective, and it comes from the verb I conceal. There's also a sense in which crypto-anarchy is secret the way that an identity might be secret. And May talks about, the accusation that somebody's a crypto-fascist. In this new world of cryptographically mediated anarchies, one might not even know you were an anarchist. And then, of course, the centrality of cryptology, the science of sending secure, unbreakable communications, factors into the naming here. If I were to sum it all up, I'd say that crypto-anarchy describes the peer relationship, social, political, and economic, existing at the intersection of cryptography and computer networking. Perfect. So what are some examples of crypto-anarchy? One of the things that's really interesting about this project and that drew me to it is that a lot of the things May was talking about at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, came to pass, and he was able to stipulate exactly how much time it would take for computing to kind of generate the necessary resources to enact these sorts of crypto-anarchies. Okay, dark networks are something May described. Examples of these today, which I can go into a little later or in the Q&A, are Freenet, Tor, I2P, anonymous browsers, way to access internets that aren't indexed by a search engine like Google, which we tend to call the ClearNet. Darknet markets, most popularly Silk Road and Agora. These are places where people could freely trade contraband, both digital items, natively digital items, and buy things that would be shipped to their door through various postal services. Digital cash and cryptocurrency, The best examples here are Bitcoin, the most ubiquitous form of digital cash, but better still Monero, which is a functionally anonymous digital cash. Electronic contracts. This is something else May described in a lot of detail, which now exists robustly on the internet. The place that we most associate with these smart contracts is Ethereum. It's a blockchain, which I'll talk a little bit about blockchain later. And then multi-party escrow. This is a way to have a trade with somebody that you don't trust and secure your funds with a third party so that even in the absence of that trust, the product gets delivered and the funds go to the right actors. So these are some examples of crypto-anarchy. But as you can see, they're all pretty specific to the economic sphere. They're thoroughly marketized. And it's about individuals who are accessing internet connections, using cryptographic protocols in order to play in these new anarchies that are emerging. As May wrote his crypto-anarchist manifesto, which was kind of his magnum opus, advances in computational cryptography were unlocking the possibility of global financial markets transacting at the speed of information. It's no wonder that from the context of this epical moment in the advance of technological capital, May's focus was explicitly computational and mostly economic. Yet the market chauvinism of May's crypto-anarchy is underdetermined by his own premises. There is nothing necessarily computational about hiding, secretivity, or even cryptology. In fact, May's exposition of the political dynamics inherent to crypto-anarchy suggests the question, where did crypto-anarchy come from? Weren't folks evading capital controls, communicating in secret, and transacting contraband before the advent of dark networks and digital cash? I'm going to turn now to my project, which I describe sort of as unfettering crypto-anarchy from economics by separating the logic of crypto, hiding concealment as a political tactic, from its anarchist projects, then interrogating crypto as a technique of resistance in order to extract its political tendencies. The lens I'm using here is technopolitics. I think it's important just as a quick shorthand that's becoming popular in some academies. And what technopolitics does is it acknowledges the inextricable knot between technical being on the one hand and political activity on the other. Technologies are not politically neutral. They're not born neutral. While politics always operates within and through technological strata. So when we talk about politics, when we talk about technology, we have to acknowledge the way in which these are mutually reinforcing. And this was a point that was made, I think, most popularly by the science and technology theorist Langdon Winter. So when I'm talking about crypto moving forward here, and when I'm taking off that appended anarchy for a moment just to look at the crypto piece of the equation, I'm talking about a technique. It's the technique of concealment, the technique of hiding what you don't want the state to see, hiding what you don't want others to see, and it's the political productivity of hiding. And I think one of the tensions here that I want to explore is hiding just a quietism when we view politics as something that happens in public, when we view politics as something that's predicated on a sort of radical transparency. Is hiding just a form of quietism, or does it have its own form of political potency, or its own mode of political subject formation and speech? So I'm going to make a couple of claims here, and this is what I call the technopolitical logic of crypto. As a technique of political resistance, crypto, one, entails disidentification. Down here. Crypto entails disidentification because acts of political concealment produce a specific subject who cannot become identical with any actor in the open political arena. I'm going to turn to some vignettes in a second that illustrate this logic in a less abstract and kind of theoretical way by focusing in on crypto technologies. Two, the technopolitical logic of crypto resists political representation because the boundaries of the concealed or anonymous group cannot be fixed by identity criteria. That group becomes difficult or impossible to authoritatively represent, certainly in the open political sphere. Crypto establishes a speech situation. It advances a set of negative demands to not be surveilled and identified, to evade censorship and the enforcement of a language in which to speak, to refuse subsumption within a public, etc. So I think crypto is a productive speech situation. And the logic of crypto spawns alternative trust infrastructures. Because when we can no longer rely on the open political arena and its legal juridical architecture, when we can no longer rely on the parameters and criteria of identity, we have to find other ways to trust each other. We have to find other ways to build and act through trust. So start kind of with a softball here to exemplify a couple of these parameters that I've outlined. I want to talk about masks as a technology for hiding and a specifically political technology for concealment. That has been around for a long time. If I were to put more research into this project, I would like to study how cultures far before the Renaissance European ones used masks and disguises as a political technology. But here I'll just start with the bauta, which is a mask that emerged in Venice in the 16th century. For periods of time, this mask was actually mandatory at political decision-making events. So it's kind of an awkward thing to imagine now that you have a Congress, but all of them have to be masked so that identity and the sort of authority of a face becomes less, becomes more difficult to abuse. This tactic of allowing people to mask themselves didn't work well for the Venetian government, and they eventually outlawed it in 1797. Other examples of masking in a political context I think are ubiquitous, and I don't have to spend much time on them at an anarchist conference. The German autonomists used bicycle helmets, famously, the Zapatistas with their ski masks, anti- and ultra-globalization activists, Occupy protesters around the globe. The picture on the right displays protesters who stood against the World Trade Organization using these masks, and below is a collection of Zapatistas in ski masks. When we think about the political logic of the mask as a technology for concealment to enable political resistance, I'm interested in something that the philosopher Thomas Nail said about masks, which is that the mask is part of a new set of political strategies that rejects political representation and identity in favor of direct democracy and equality. The mask rejects the political representation of the party and state. It creates a political universalism, and it supports direct democracy and egalitarianism. This is Thomas Nail's wager. I don't think it's so clean-cut as this, and I would like to problematize these distinctions if I had more time. But for now, what I want to focus on is the way that masks bring somebody out of the mode of identity that they might normally relate to their comrades in, and they put them into a universal mode of identity where agents become more substitutive, and it becomes more difficult to make identity claims without taking off the mask and re-identifying yourself within some sort of a social order. Now, this next vignette, to speak of the secret society, which was in Andalusia, rural Spain, in around the 1880s. This survives from a time where I really wanted to talk about Jacques Rancière and do an analysis of La Mano Negra through a Rancièrean lens. I think there's still a lesson to be painted here, and I'll try and do it fairly quickly. So the context of La Mano Negra as a secret society is that in 1974, a conservative government took power in Andalusia, and they outlawed the Spanish Regional Federation of the International Working Men of the World, or International Working Men's Association, which henceforth I'll just call the IWMA. And La Mano Negra specifically in 1874 was an underground offshoot of the IWMA. They wanted to continue the struggle against capital and against the landed class in Andalusia, but they wanted to do so in a way that wouldn't open them to reprisal by the conservative government. Now, the way that the Spanish left, the syndicalist left in Spain, responded to La Mano Negra is pretty interesting. They viewed La Mano Negra as criminal and demented peasants with no specific political intentionality. Now, a year earlier, they would have been talking about their own members. Now that La Mano Negra had gone into hiding, establishing that membership became the entire conflict in Andalusia. Did La Mano Negra exist? If it existed, were the members of La Mano Negra true workers, true members of the IWMA, or were they just criminal and demented peasants with no specific political intentionality? What the Spanish Regional Federation of the IWMA ended up saying was that true workers associations, true workers movements, only fought in the open political arena. And thus La Mano Negra, who they viewed as a bunch of thieves and kidnappers and assassins, were not true workers, regardless of if they'd been members of the IWMA in 1974, and when it was reconstituted in the early 80s, they were going to rejoin again. So it became, the criterion of membership here became, you must be able to be represented in the open political arena, or you're just not a true worker. You're not part of our clique. And you don't share our politicity. In fact, you're not a political animal if we cannot represent you in the open political arena. You're just a demented peasant. Now, for La Mano Negra, appearing in public and becoming represented in the open political arena would have been impossible, because the mandate of the group, stipulated that anybody who revealed their identity and claimed to speak for the secret society would face, at the worst, capital punishment and some other form of repression otherwise. So to come into the open political arena and speak for La Mano Negra was impossible. You could not represent La Mano Negra as such. It was written into the rules of the secret society. Okay? So in this way, this act of concealment, this act of going into hiding by members of the IWMA, the upright poor as they called themselves of the IWMA in rural Andalusia, effectively meant that their group could no longer play within the representational sphere of the open political arena. Cryptography. Now I'll talk a little bit more about more current versions of what I call this techno-political logic of crypto, ones that May was engaging with a little bit more. Cryptography until 1996 was regulated under the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation Law. So to send a disk with a cryptographic protocol across state borders or to export it was functionally trafficking munitions. It would be regulated and prosecuted the same way. Now, what May and the cypherpunks in general, and many other sort of California libertarians, members of the EFF at the time, John Perry Barlow, people in this milieu, the way they responded was to say, how is this any different from requiring speech in some language? You won't let us speak in a cipher. How is this any different from saying, in this country or in this polity, you will only speak in English? Of course, this happens too. This is a speech situation. And this was precisely the claim of the crypto-anarchists. And eventually, this was a legal claim that went all the way to the Supreme Court and won, such that by 2000, we lived in a completely different world where everybody had access to strong cryptography, and the crypto-anarchies that I described at the beginning of the talk were beginning to emerge as a response of this free trade and exportation of cryptographic protocols. Now, this demonstrates how crypto creates a speech situation. It's a demand to be able to speak. It's a demand to be able to speak in a way that is not intelligible to the state. Just like I suspect there are many languages that are still refuges from the state, which may be near forgotten, but in which we might very well speak if we wanted to be unintelligible to the police as such. So crypto creates a speech situation and a set of negative demands and this positive demands to be able to speak in a language of one's choosing. And lastly, I'm going to talk about alternative trust infrastructure. Crypto necessitates alternative ways of learning to trust one another. And this is where I'll talk about the technology that underlies Bitcoin, which is called a blockchain. I'm not going to talk about it at a technical level. If folks want to ask me how it works or they've heard about it before and want some specific questions answered, they can feel free to come up to me. I spoke about it last year, so I'm just for the sake of maybe not too much NASA and redundancy, I'll avoid speaking in depth about it again. The blockchain lets people who have no particular confidence in each other collaborate without having to go through a neutral central authority. Simply put, it is a machine for creating trust. So one of the things that cryptographic protocols allow us to do is find ways to trust one another without needing to reveal one another's identities. This next bit I'm not going to actually talk about because I'm running out of time and I only have one more slide after this. But what I want to point out here is that there are lots of ways to hide, and not all of them mean becoming invisible. Sometimes you're hiding in plain sight. Steganography is the art of hiding a message in an image. Okay? This is the logic of crypto. This is the logic of deliberate concealment. You could use this to pass a message past the border patrol. But it's a form of hiding in plain sight. So hiding isn't always this completely negative phenomenon like air-gapped computers which have never connected to the internet, or temporary autonomous zones or underground networks or something. There are lots of ways that the logic of crypto plays out in the aesthetic realm of sensibilities and what is seen and perceived. The only thing I'll speak about here is that cryptographic consensus comes in a lot of forms, and an example of how diverse the logic of crypto can be would be the BitTorrent protocol, or torrent protocols in general. Ways to avoid copyright through piracy by file sharing across peer-to-peer networks of connected computer nodes. This is an example of a form of hiding that I call hiding in the crowd, where your only security is really that there are just so many other people doing this that it would be a pain in the ass to go and find you. So what I want to do is reimagine Crypto-Anarchy after Tim May. And the window of opportunity to do this has just opened because Tim May died like a couple months ago. So reimaginings here can become fertile. My claim is that political resistance in the age of the surveillance state involves a melange of crypto techniques and technologies. Mastering these tactics and inventing new methods for concealment will be critical to the continuation of at least certain militant anarchist projects. The one that I want to speak about to make this a little bit more concrete in my final minutes here is something I talked about at a different conference called Theorizing the Web a while back, Crypto-Anarchic Fabrication Networks. This isn't something I'm inventing, it's something I'm describing that I did a little bit of ethnography, and I found some people who were engaging in this particular form of practice. I'll just describe it really quickly and then end my talk. So a renegade employee at a firm uses a 3D scanner to generate a digital blueprint of a product. This data file is leaked over a secure connection to a darknet repository. From there, the blueprint is downloaded and proliferated over peer-to-peer file sharing clients until its metadata is cached across online pirate databases. Crafters at a local makerspace 3D print and distribute copies of the object. This is an example of what I'm calling the logic of crypto-anarchy, acted out in places that are other than cyberspace. This is crypto-anarchy getting into your makerspace. It touches cryptography. It relies on cryptography. There may even be a financial element at some point in the trajectory, but what comes out the other side is a new way of producing and fabricating objects, which relies on this logic of concealment and hiding and the techniques and technologies that are involved with it. I met an individual who was 16. Their nephew could not afford a prosthetic limb, and so this individual 3D scanned the one that they could buy and printed it off in their garage in perpetuity at the cost of raw materials. We're talking about a $2,000 prosthesis that now costs $15, $20 to print at most. This was a 16-year-old in their garage, right? This is how powerful these new logics of concealment can be sometimes. So there are, I'll just have this one paragraph to read in conclusion. Crypto-anarchic fabrication networks are one imagination of a crypto-anarchy encompassing but not limited to financial cryptography. They ask us to envision crypto as something that remakes our garages or communal spaces as temporary autonomous zones for the production of necessities, hidden from sight. Crypto-anarchies and anarchisms are techno-political artifacts that include the Black Bloc and the Secret Society, as well as the blockchain and the darknet forum. Many techniques will be required to sustain the insurrections that in turn sustain us. The technique of crypto, where it intersects the politics of anarchism, invites us to theorize, innovate, and practice those methods of revolting against the state that also protect our movements against reprisal or subsumption. That's all I've got for today. Thanks, folks, for listening.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Gunas. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned co-op in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a catalog of Firestorm's books and zines, plus a full calendar of events up at their website, firestorm.coop.